Hello everyone, welcome to our panel on world building and world presentation. We have an excellent panel here. We have Guy Sclanders, the founder of Geeks Table and well known for his YouTube channel, How to Be a Great Games Master, which I highly recommend. I learn a lot from it. I don't always agree, but I enjoy disagreeing as much as I enjoy agreeing. Steve Turner is the lead designer of Chivalry and Sorcery. The 5th edition is out now, and hands up confession, I'm one of his minions on that. But I will not treat him with any of the deference he feels he deserves. And and he is the creator of the game world of Marrakesh. Kirsten Hofstad has been a player and GM and DM or GM if you prefer for about 20 years. She is currently based in Bahrain, where I think, Kirsten, you are considered the first female GM in Bahrain.
Apparently.
I don't know. We'll wishy-wash that a bit and say,
I mean, I
one
doubt
of
it,
and
but I was in the
considered.
paper for it, so that makes it true, right?
Got to be true. It was in the paper. Kirsten is into vampire, planescape, and anything dramatic. So we'll see how dramatic we can get this session. The first step that people normally think of in world building is the act of sort of physically designing your own world. Kirsten, I'd like to start with you because you tend to use a lot of published settings. The thing that most people might not consider is that even if you're using a published setting, you have a lot to do to bring that world to life. There is world building involved in using a published setting. What do you really sort of look for in a published setting? How do you bring it to life at the table?
Um, I I tend to look, okay, so I do both vampire and D&D, and my
Hmm.
some of my favorite things from both of those settings, even though they're wildly different, is the old content, which kind of leaves it up to you. Like it says, here's some NPCs, here's some locations, set your players loose. Um, obviously, looking at the newer kind of stuff that's published, it's very different. Um, and it has story hooks and all that in all these places, but the old stuff doesn't. And so then it involves a lot more world building in that you have to figure out what's going to happen with this loose collection of stuff. Um, and so that's one of the things I really enjoy doing is I'll go and pick things from different modules. And vampires like that too. There's different cities, there's different types of supernaturals. You can pick things from all the different things and kind of put it together. So the main world building is how you make it cohesive. Um, and I can't really say I have one way of doing that, but I just sort of, kind of set up like I write notes like, here's this location and here's the stuff here. And the players might go do this or that. Or like, here's this NPC and here's the stuff, the plot, the story for them. And the players might plug into it here, here, here. Or maybe they won't. Right. So for world building, just take the pieces and put it together. I guess it depends on what you're trying to do. Sorry, it's very vague. But what's fun about doing that is then it's also yours. You're not just running Rise of the Rune Lords. You're not doing all of the steps in the story, but you're just creating kind of a sandbox, which is fun. So one of the things I like about using published content that way is because it really is about then what the player's story, what they do
Yeah.
with your stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know
and
if that answered the question.
yeah, no, it does, because it's really very much about sort of what you bring to the table. I mean, I'm a huge Han fan, which is a very detailed setting, and I like going through and looking for the little quirks in the canon, and you sort of go, oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What could that mean? What can I push into that? Guy, you tend to have sort of a much more freeform approach to world building. A lot of world building on the fly.
Nice way for saying lazy. Yeah, it's free form. It's open plan. It's designed by evolution. It's absolutely yes. No, I learned a long time ago that I think that people who do world build extensively, I take my hats off to them. I really, really do. But one thing that I found that worked really well was I always have a map. That's my base. I will always start with a map. And I almost take pride in drawing maps that break physics. Because I love it when players say, but that mountain range shouldn't exist there. And I go, why not? And they go, well, because there's this or there's that. I love people who do that. Don't get me wrong. Plate tectonics is fascinating. But from my perspective, I'm going, well, go and investigate that mountain range. Because the people who live there, they believe that that mountain range is real because they actually live there and they mine that mountain. So go find out why it doesn't fit there. If your character even thinks that. That's just me being pedantically vindictive, I think, as a designer more than anything else. I like to keep it open. There are a few things I do design first, principally things that will come up often. So I'm currently working on a project, actually, where it's like you need a tavern, but what do you need in that tavern? What is stuff that your players are going to be asking for, but they're going to ask that in almost every tavern. So I'm creating I have created a bunch of short form. This is what a room costs. This is what a room with a bathtub costs. This is what a room with a bathtub and an anvil costs because you want to repair your armor. These are the types of meals. Here's a random list of like 100 names for the serving wenches and the tavern keep. So that's kind of as far as I'll go. If there's a big organization that I need, then I'll sort of sketch it out. But something that I have found in doing it this way, when a player comes to me and says, oh, I want to play a 4-armed cat person, I go, all right, let's look at the map. Well, I haven't defined anything for that map, so that's now controlled by 4 armed cat people. You tell me their history and their culture and what it is that they do, and I will add that to my world. And because I used to have just repeat players for decades, it became really part of their world as well, because they had kind of created the 4-armed cat people, and so now they're part of canon. But yeah, I definitely do not advocate that this is the right way to do it. If you like to know what's going on, then avoid this like the plague, because they will be asking you questions that you just have to make up and then prove later, or figure out how it fits later. It's like, did I really say they're whales flying in the sky? Okay. They are there. Where they come from? Not a clue. You better go and find out. There's an adventure for you. I think maybe that comes from being a teacher, where when I used to lecture, students ask you a question, you're like, that's a brilliant question. You all go home and do that for homework tonight, because I will be doing the same thing because I don't know the answer. So it's a deflection, I say. Anyway, I'm babbling. That's me. Yep.
Right, okay, so that might be the last question that I ask you during this panel.
Yes, that's okay.
Because I don't want to be sent home to go and research it this evening. 3 out of 10 could do better. See me after school, Staples. Steve, you've taken a different approach, and over many years, you've developed the world of Marrakesh, and I know that I've only seen a very, very small part of it. Now that you have the Patreon, you're sort of releasing more bits of Marrakesh.
Yeah, it goes back to 82, really, and from an adventure, a character became a king, and so you need a kingdom. So drew a map, put mountain ranges in, no consideration about physics. Had a friend who was a geologist, and he said, you want those mountains there? Well, this is how the tectonics would be. So instead of creating the tectonics and then having the mountain ranges, we did it in reverse. And once you know what the tectonics are, you can think, well, there's going to be gold there, silver there, and that starts to create a background for the cultures, and then building it up from there. But, yeah, pinching ideas from all around the world, different ideas. The main kingdom is a mishmash of North American, Native American culture, sandwiched with Scottish clan culture, sandwiched with early feudal, and it's a real mishmash. But I'm also a fan of Han, and the one thing I do like about Han is all their setting products are at a fixed point in time. So from a design point of view, you can always design to that year. And then anything that comes after it, it's up to the players.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, actually. I mean, I got to admit, when I do use published settings that aren't Han, and I do, I tend to ignore the timelines. The moment that the campaign begins is when our timeline begins, and if we're playing in an alternate world, not a problem. To be honest, I do the same when I'm doing historical campaigns, which I do quite a bit more of. You know, at the point the players meet and say hello is the point at which we enter a new timeline, because I don't want to tell them, you know, you can't do this because game canon, you know, says, or actually there's an obscure French chronicle that says your characters can't do that in 13th century Paris. You know, you want to use these materials as inspiration, not as chains. I think. When you're creating, we go back to sort of almost the first world builder, Tolkien. And actually, before I move on to names and getting consistent names, I'll just mention. Okay, so we're gonna start with you again on that one, Kirsten. I mentioned in the cartography panel yesterday, there's a quote that I've heard. I've been unable to source it when I've been looking recently, so this may be apocryphal. But it goes to what you were saying about plate tectonics, Steve, of somebody telling Tolkien that the mountains of Mordor could not possibly exist. And Tolkien sort of said in his best Tolkien-esque file, and I don't know whether this sounds anything like him, but, oh yes, my dear chap, I know, but I needed them for the plot. And then he sort of presumably retcons it because those mountains are formed by Ancalagan the Black, the first dragon, falling on them and flattening large areas and leaves this extraordinary shape, which is, you know, the world building master. Yep, there's magic, there's dragons. So Kirsten, naming, consistency, flavor, does naming bother you?
Not really. I just steal wholesale from the real world.
If you're running vampire and stuff, you can do that and still be consistent.
But no, I mean, even fantasy names. I mean, there's so many cool, obscure, ancient, you know, names for stuff you can steal, and nobody's going to know what that is, and it sounds cool, and it has that realistic flavor to it of being part of a language that you need for names. That's basically my tactic. I don't try to make that up.
Guy, you've already mentioned lists of names, so you put some thought into this.
Sometimes I do. I mean, I have a very easy system that I use if I need to come up with a name, is I just change the vowels. So I'll choose a real world name and John becomes Jin, and suddenly it's fantastical because Meanwhile,
exactly.
it's lit. I've got one of 5 options really, or 1 of 4 options, because you just don't, you know, John becoming John is not exactly changing it. So the advice I would give is that when I do create the worlds and I sort of populate with empires and kingdoms and names and things, is I usually try and, like I said, I'm very lazy. So I choose a culture and I'm like, all right, so in my world, all dark elves are Roman Republic. That's it. So they have a senate, they have praetors, they have centurions. It's not rocket science. But when I'm trying to come up with the names, and I will sort of look at Roman names, what were the names from those maps and things, then I will bring them across. And I'll tweak and change them so that you don't end up with a Rome, but Rimu, for example, by literally changing the vowels. One thing that I have learned, though, is that because I speak quite a few quite different languages as a person, I tend to use too much cultural influence, and then I create names that a player who only speaks one language looks at and goes, I have no idea how to pronounce this. And so that I have actually discovered is a bit of a barrier, because it puts people out. So, and no offense to Americans watching, but Americans generally speak American. And because I have a lot of Germanic languages in my repertoire, when it comes to sounds like and ach and och, they go, it's ach, it's a loch, it's a loch, or it's you know. So that's something that I would advise people to stick away from, is know your players, know your audience, so that they can pronounce it properly without them getting tongue-tied, and that you can pronounce it properly as well. We had a lovely thing. There's a weapon that is in one of the campaigns, which is from the Zulu culture, and it's the ikwa, and you have to make the click. Otherwise, it just is. It's on paper, it looks like gibberish. So I think when it comes to naming, that's something important to bear in mind, is what your people can actually say out aloud, or what you can say out loud too.
We have that problem sometimes when we're doing medieval England, and Americans have no idea that what's written Tocester is pronounced toaster, or what looks like it's Belvoir is beaver.
Right. And even the English have differences on how to pronounce Shrewsbury.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, my friend from Shrewsbury always calls it Shrewsbury, but people from outside often call it Shrewsbury. And the people in Southwell or Southwell can't even decide for themselves whether it's Southwell or Southwell.
Yeah,
but on naming it, sorry, this is not supposed to be about me, but I will allow myself one anecdote. Our glorious leader in the GRC, I was running a first edition AD&D game for Gygax Day, and he was playing an elf. And Omar, what's your character called? And he said, come back to me. I'm trying to think up something suitably elven. So I went around the table and the players all gave me their character names, and got back to Omar. Okay, Omar, what's your character name? He said 14 apostrophes and an E. I said, wouldn't 14 apostrophes and an A-E be more elven? He said, I don't want to over-egg the elven pudding.
Yeah.
Now, later in the game, I wanted to know what his character was doing. So I said, and so what is doing? He said, it's pronounced E. Thank you. Needless to say, that wasn't the most sensible of sessions.
Yeah, I
Steve,
think
Steve, you've gone to constructing languages and alphabets, and
back in the early 80s, Dragon Magazine had an article called "How to Speak Orcish," and using that as an inspiration, we started looking at some of the names we'd given towns, and said, "Well, what do those names actually mean?" And started to create a language. And we thought, well, how's it spoken? We're using my schoolboy German. We've modelled the language on German for sentence construction and grammar. Changed some of the consonants and vowels around. And it started to develop. So it gave the people some sort of culture and meaning. A lot of the other village names on there completely non-connected at all. There's a great book from Judges Guild called Village Names, which was completely random, and that's how a lot of those have been generated.
Does anybody go to the extent of sort of building history into their names? You know, you see, you've got a one wave of settlements with an older language no longer spoken. I'm thinking where I come from. We were an ancient British kingdom in the north of England, Elmet, and my village has a Saxon name component and a British name component. Near us, sort of surrounded by towns and villages with Anglo-Saxon derivations to their names. There's a mountain called Pen-y-Ghent, which sounds like Welsh. It's actually an old language called Cambrian or Cumbrian. It's the northern, no longer spoken. And so the translation isn't certain. It could mean head of the winds, which I really, really like, because anything to do with wind, fantastic. But you've got does anybody really go into that level of depth, or is that too much, too far?
Well, I do that for characters. If I'm creating a character, I'll do that, because the character name is, I think, one of the most important things that you can do. So the character name, yes, I like to unpack that, but that's from a family tree perspective and to see where those origins came from. I can't say I've ever done it in a world where there's different names, except when I have forgotten the name of the city and called it something else. And the players have called me out on it. And I went, oh, no, but that's just the Elvish name. And then made a note of it. It's like, well, now that's what it's called in Elvish. I don't know why it would be different. I think that's Tolkien, though, because he confused me for a long time when I started reading his bloody book. And it was, what was it, Wraithrendir or Mithrandir and Gandalf. I'm like, who the hell's this Mithrandir bloke who's just shown up now? Where does he come from, you know? But yeah, so that's me. I don't go that far.
I know in Marrakesh I created a language tree of all the different languages and how they're connected. But that was purely as a result of Chivalry and Sorcery 2nd edition, where Power Word mages needed to learn lots of different languages. And just sort of having a whole list of which ones were modern and which ones were ancient. But as for having any actual words related to those languages, no, or not yet.
And Kirsten, you draw from the real world, and sort of coming from America, you've got cultural influences from all over the place. So does that bear in mind when you're picking names? Do the names create names for you?
One of the cool things about running Vampire is vampires can literally be ancients from those lost times. And so part of the thing I really enjoy about playing historical is that I can look back at some of those lost cultures and stuff that we know about them now, and kind of try to pull some of that in, and it's really alien to people who don't know this stuff. It's very cool. So yeah, I mean, but again, I try to use what we have already, because making stuff up is kind of beyond my scope of running my game right now, and it doesn't make sense to you in a world set in the real world anyway. So it's fun. I enjoy you know, working on dead languages and stuff, trying to find as much information, you know. I have a friend who in college, we would get books from interlibrary loan from the other UC systems to try and figure out, okay, can we find an ancient map of Cairo and try to figure out what was actually in the city at this time, because we were playing Vampire set in Cairo at the time. And, you know, so that kind of stuff is really fun. It leads you to this whole like treasure hunt of the real world. So if you're playing a system set in the real world, then there's plenty of really cool stuff. You don't need to make stuff up. Honestly, history is really interesting.
Google's really sort of resolved the necessity of those interlibrary loans, and I do remember doing that as well.
Yeah,
but
that was
Google is fantastic. Map of 12th century Cairo.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is early 13th century. It'll do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the research that is out there is phenomenal. I still like my dead trees.
And I feel like you could use that in a D&D campaign too, if you wanted to. If you want to make a city in your world that is like Cairo, I mean, shoot.
What does get me a little bit these days is I use these all for research, but if I'm running a modern day game, I keep forgetting that the players have access to the internet. I grew up without it. I'm not a digital native, so.
I think you've got a good point there, though, Andy. I'm playing in a game at the moment where the GM is great, and I'm happy to play in his games, but he set it in Victorian London, and we're running in a chase sequence. Now, he's, just to give some context, he's from Australia and has never been to London. And we ran into St. Paul's, and then we ran across the street into Big Ben, and then we ran across from Big Ben. We just sort of did a hop and a skip, and suddenly we were in the tower, and then we were there, and then we were there. His geography was all over the place. And I said to him, well, are there chandeliers hanging in St. Paul's? And he went, yeah, sure, there's chandeliers hanging. There aren't any, because they don't do that. And you know, but knowing that he didn't know allowed for those kind of questions to happen, which was a bit of a cheat, I admit, but it was dramatic and it was fun. But I think doing research is important, regardless of whether you're a lazy GM or not. So if you're like me and you don't want to do any research and you make everything up, but you also still read so you can make stuff up that sort of remotely resembles something that makes sense. But if you are setting it, I think that's brilliant. Researching, perfect idea.
Google Maps is a great resource. You know, if you're setting a Wild West game in the Rockies or something, I've never been to North America, but, you know, you can put the 3D view on and sort of stand on top of a mountain and see what you can see from there.
One of the cool things you can do with Google Maps, and I have had games that did this, was you could take a map, like say you're running a modern day like mine. Well, mine's set in the 80s, but anyway, it's another story. You could take a modern map of the city and then make it yours. So you can put pins for things that the players know are in the game. And I've done that before. It's really effective because then they're like going on the street view, like, I want to go on this street over here. And you don't have to do any of the work.
So let's move on less onto the research, because I love research. I over research. I delay games because I need just one more book describing what it was like to be a ship's cook on a 1930s tramp steamer. Let's talk about presenting it. Guy, you mentioned player maps, and I was wondering, with your sort of very free-form approach, whether you actually went as far as handouts. But you mentioned player maps. Talk to me about how you might draw players into a world from giving them stuff to touch, feel, and look at.
Yes. So when I was a wee young lad, and I had all the time in on my hands, I would then draw lots of maps. I would hand draw them, and I'd my whole family were very an arty sort of family, so old burnt parchment paper and all that kind of wonderful stuff. Then you start to get the cold reality of real life, and you get very lazy. And then in my case, I suddenly had a YouTube channel where I had sponsors saying, well, we'll pay you if you use our products. And then you have to actually start using those products. And then you get to virtual, where now I don't have a single game that's around a table. And so online, it's very difficult for me to say, well, I'll sketch it out on a little piece of paper and then hold it up to the screen. So yeah, I do maps for specifically important things. I don't do maps for unimportant things. So if it's a tavern, we don't need a map for that. But if it's the jail that they're trying to break into, then I will very specifically make them a map. If it's a visual puzzle, or if almost any puzzle, actually, I try to give them a visual aid as well, because a lot of people don't think in words or in pictures in their heads. They kind of need some sort of tactile thing. So if it's going to enhance the game, then I use it. If it's just going to slow the game down, then I don't use it. That's my usual sort of rule as to whether I make it or not.
Do you use any props? I mean, I know when I've seen sort of some of your streamed games and what have you, where you're on stage and sort of people are often in some form of costume and what have you. Sort of, how much of that is for the presentation? How much, when you're really sort of doing your own games, do you use the kind of clothing or have props to hand out?
Well, I think in terms of clothing and props and stuff, when it got too heavy, I just went and played a LARP, which is pretty much the same thing, really. But no, around the table when there isn't a camera pointed at us, then usually it's if I have time, I'll make stuff. And I used to love making terrain, and sort of putting down, even if it was just an old Chessex battle map, and drawing that out, but then still being able to put walls and trees and use little miniatures and that sort of thing. That is what I will do for a home game, especially if it's an invested one and it's going on for a long time. Otherwise, I'll commission art for it. I think my last round the table group, I commissioned portraits for all of their characters, just to say, you know, this is our last game. We knew it was only going to run for a year and a half. And so I sort of went that extra step, I suppose. But if there's a world map, that will always be printed out in multiple copies, so that each player's got a copy with laminate, so they can draw on it, they can pin it, that sort of thing. Virtual, of course, there's lots of software that we can use these days. So, and I'm happy to talk about that, but I won't talk about it now.
Steve, you're a miniatures war gamer in Origin. Do you? So miniatures are forms of props. You know, what do you do when you're not running games on Discord or Google Hangouts, as you're going to do for us later this afternoon?
I do use miniatures where possible, but I have to agree with Guy with the mapping. I too started out with mapping, to the point that some of them were getting really silly, like doing a jetty and drawing in all of the knots and that in the planks on the jetty. And then sort of thinking, this is getting a bit silly. And then starting, well, I'll go from that. And Ordnance Survey have got a really good map key. We'll do all our maps to OS standard.
As an old boy scout, the Ordnance Survey is the thing to aim for when you're mapping.
And but yeah, running a game face to face, I do use miniatures. Where possible, I do use handouts. Certainly, the adventures that we're going to be putting up on Patreon, they've got handouts to give to players. And yeah, we've all done the burnt scroll. Try not to set fire to the
Coffee works really well to fake it. Coffee.
Yeah, well, once you're standing with cold coffee, and then you're sitting there, especially with a gas cooker, just to burn the edges.
Yeah. Kirsten, I mean, I guess with the modern day stuff, a 1980s A to Z of New York, or street map of York is a really good prop there. Do you search out these things, or is it narrative?
My game is a text based, so I use pictures and stuff though, from the 80s, or I try to. I'm kind of going for like a Stranger Things vibe, but the nostalgic for the 80s kind of thing. So like I do that with like fonts, and try to kind of it's different in text, but try to make it 80s-y, I guess.
I hope you don't search my Facebook for latest pictures. I did at one point have an orange mullet.
Oh, good. Oh, perfect. Yes. Send me a picture. I'll make you an NPC.
It was for a Rocky Horror Show performance, I have to say.
Perfect.
As well as handouts, I think one of the big things with presenting your world is narration. Do you have any tricks for narrative that you're going to use? And I'll start off one of my. I wish I remembered to do this in a game more often, but I try and remind myself to try and appeal to at least 3 of the 5 senses in a description. Sight and sound are the obvious ones, but smells carry a huge amount of emotional memory for people. Touch, of course, can be cold, or clammy, or prickle heats, if it's really hot weather. What do you do? How much atmosphere and world building do you put into the narration, or is it bam bam action? Kirsten, if we start with you this time.
Like I said, my main game right now that I'm running is text based, so I have to do that. Otherwise, it's all kind of ephemeral, and part of it is writing chops and all that. So yeah, I love and vampire is like 90% atmosphere anyway. So I really enjoy writing really descriptive text about creepy things and dark situations and all that. Yeah, it's a big part of writing in text, is making sure you appeal to all the senses, because that's all you have to go on is the words. So
Steve?
Yeah, I think using the descriptions, but I go back to one of the things that Ed Symbolist once said, that when you're playing the NPCs, put on a voice, put on an accent. And my accent at the moment is because I've had lots and lots of telephone training. And when I'm running a game, I can quite easily slip into a really broad black country accent. Which,
oh, show us. Do it for us.
Well, I mean, yeah. What you up to?
A slightly longer sentence there. Let's get people get the flavour of black country here.
Well, it's a bustling place to live. It's quite guttural, and you don't live posh like them folks up in Brummagem.
I've got to admit, I have my best telephone voice on as well, because I'm from Yorkshire, and for the few years I was before I moved to the Middle East, I was living in Barnsley City. Guy, what are your tips for atmosphere and presentation. I know you love voices, and you've lived in numerous places. You've got quite a knack for voices, so I'm assuming that, like Steve, you like your voices.
Definitely. I love doing voices. When I'm not doing something for public consumption, I default to music a lot. So I'll use the 5 senses. I consciously make a note. If in this descriptor I've described the room as being, say, cold and smelling of old newspapers, then the players will do something, and then I'll come back, because I consciously try, I know it doesn't seem like it in this interview, but I try to not talk as much as the players talk. So I aim for a few little succinct pointers, but my music collection, I collect soundtracks. It's one of the many hobbies I have. And then I'll go, all right, so for this particular sequence, I want it to be dark and grim, so I'm going to go and use this music. And the reason why I use film soundtracks is because they usually don't contain lyrics, so that they don't get in the way, they don't intrude, and that the players don't sit there suddenly starting to hum along with the song. It's film music, and film music is meant to be invisible. It's meant to just create tone and mood. So for me, it's a perfect resource. It does take some getting used to. I had players who knew that when I put a certain soundtrack on, they're like, "Oh my God, we're going to die." You put that death music on, and people. It was weird how they would train themselves, but because soundtrack's also structured like a film, if you following along as the GM in the background and you're listening to where the music is, you know that the next audio cue is going to be a dramatic chase sequence, because the film has to go in emotional waves as well. So the soundtrack does the same thing. And if you're sharp, you can get your scene to suddenly take on the new pace, and then it feels as if the music is matching what's happening in the scene. How do you control the music and the scene at the same time? It's like, no, it's just timing and knowing your rules. So I use music a lot. I wish I could do it online. I really, really do. But legalities and copyright and all that sort of, wonderful.
Even sometimes they setting up an extra channel to play music on your on your rig and still be able to do voice can be a little bit of a technical challenge for duffers like me.
Yes. It does take a lot of fiddling.
Yeah. Does weather come into your descriptions at all? I often tend to forget weather. I'll describe it in an opening sequence, and then in my head it's a sort of warm early summer day all year round, unless I remember to describe what crops are growing, because I studied medieval agriculture, and that reminds me that's a really geeky thing to get you. Oh yeah, okay, so it's probably spring. Yes, okay, warm rains. But then I'll forget about it again. We'll go in reverse order now. I'm trying to mix this up a little bit. So Guy, the weather, does that play a...
It's usually seasonal, so the 4 seasons I will work through very, very quickly. And then if the players say, "Oh, what's the weather like today?" I'll roll a d8. 1, it's sunny. 8, it's miserable, wet and raining. And everywhere in between, it might be windy or neutral. But yes, it's for me, it's just the 4 seasons. Because those might have a mechanical impact on what the players can and can't do. Again, having grown up in a country where 30 degrees is the average, plate mail is not something that you're going to be wandering around in on a regular basis. So I do try and enforce that if the players go into a desert country or things like
that. Steve?
Yeah, I've frequently used weather as an impact. Coming from a rather damp country, there's nothing more like giving the players a week of constant rain, cold constant rain, to sort of make them all feel a bit despondent before you actually give them an encounter.
Are you gonna have it drizzling there, or sleeting, or are you gonna have sort of the... So I'm just telling you, I come from the same country, and we've got about 50 different ways of describing rain.
There's sort of intermittent torrential rain, moving to the nice misty stuff that goes through all layers of clothing.
East 5. East 5, good to fair.
Yes. And then trudging through mud, with the mud seeping into your boots as well. And And then you start giving them an encounter with slippy underfoot conditions.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bit I always forget. I forget to actually give the narrative description a game impact.
Yes.
Kirsten?
Yeah, I'm in a similar boat as you, Andy. I usually forget weather. I had a DM who did the same as Guy, though. He would roll. We would go, "What's it like today?" And he had a little bot in Roll20 that he would roll, and then always rolled sunny. So he was like, "Whatever," and gave up. But that's about as far as we got with that.
There are some games where you have sort of a weather lore or a weather watching skill, you know, and they always want to know. So you have to make it up then.
Well, if you play like a weather druid or something, like, you know.
Yeah, but give me half an hour into the game session, I've completely forgotten what I've told.
Yeah, exactly. I'm the same.
I did want to move on to some aspects of maintaining your campaign, but we are running rather short on time.
We have questions too,
and we have questions as well, and some of these relate to maintaining.
Okay.
There's a really good one from Nessa here, which I'm really good. I think, having grown up in the countryside and sort of studied medieval villages and agriculture and what have you, is how do you make a city come to life in your world? Kirsten, you've taught a fair bit about city play.
Yeah, because, well, in both of my campaigns that I've run recently, one was Planescape, which all revolves around Sigil, if anybody knows that. That's a giant ring city. And then, you know, Vampire is all about the city that the vampires are in. For Sigil, it's so fun because there's so much source material in it. So basically the way I make it living is partially that map that I linked, and I just tell the players, okay, you're in Sigil for a week. What are you guys going to go do? And they go look at it and they find something and they want to go there. And then, oh my God, there's content for that. There's an NPC and I know who it is and, like, you know, all that. So that's part of it. And then part of it is to have stuff always happening. So they go off to adventure and they come back and things have changed. Which, you know, because of the way some of the plot lines for Planescape work, it specifically says this happens at a certain point. And the way I run it, the players can't do all of the quests. So for the things they didn't do, things change in the city while they're gone. And so that's it's just really great. I love Sigil as a setting, and the changes that happen to the city over the various adventures that are set there are really fun. You know, so what happened? There was a shop there, but now it's a rubble, and there's graffiti all over the walls, and then they get distracted from what they were doing to chase this other quest line that they had opted out of. And it's like, it turns out you could have stopped that, and then they're like, ah! So that's a really fun thing. And then for Vampire, again, it's just sort of research, you know, like I was talking about getting interlibrary loans on ancient Cairo. If you really know what it was like and you have these obscure details, it really makes it seem like my current game is set in Texas, and so I have all these kind of, you know, institutions like, here's the line dancing place, and it's kind of like it's specific to that city. And you know,
I want to see
players.
Vampires line dancing. That would
None of
be
them have
awesome.
taken me up on it. They're all like, we're too cultured for that. I'm like, you're in Texas, jeez.
The gangrels surely will be line dancers. You know, they're the country types.
Yes. So basically just being authentic and then having things change organically, you know, based on stuff happening.
Guy, how would you approach a city as opposed to another setting?
Cities are tricky. Well, insofar as I think that we kind of get overwhelmed sometimes because we want to make them all, you know, big and full of life. I usually just give my NPCs 3 things to think about, so that when the players interact, I mean, I'll describe the city and it's like there's markets and there's stalls, and if they're walking through the market, I'll do all the different voices shouting fresh fish and lavender and get your swords and that sort of thing. But that's usually the first off. But once they start interacting with the NPCs, if you think about most NPCs who are selling something or who are doing something, they have 3 things on their mind. And that's either I need to do this job and I need to do it today, or it's how am I going to get laid, or it's what am I going to eat and how can I get to eating it faster. So I have those 3 things in my head, so that when a player character walks up to the blacksmith and says, yeah, can you make me some metal armor? Oh, well, that's a job. So yes, I can make you the metal armor. It's going to cost you this. It's going to cost you that. You want extra stuff. That's going to prevent me from getting home, getting fed, and getting into bed. So now I might be a little bit more surly. Or they stop a courtier who's on a very important mission, and as soon as he's done that mission, he can go and get food, or he can go to the brothel, or, you know. And what I find that does is it kind of gives the players a sense that they haven't just stepped into the space where there are all these looped NPCs just waiting for them to arrive, but there's people who are doing stuff and going places and have things to do and things to eat and that sort of thing. So that's my usual approach.
I like that. That also nicely answers Yasmin's question on making NPCs more three-dimensional. My little trick for that is just purely to steal the method acting thing of thinking, if I'm playing a random NPC I haven't planned before, is what's my motivation here?
Yeah.
And take as read the fact that they actually want to survive the encounter with the players, which is never a certainty for NPCs. You know, I was just starting to watch your video on 10 ways to deal with murder hobos, but I haven't finished it yet. So, you know, I want to live.
Yeah. I like throwing in with CNS being a medieval towns and stuff. Every so often, just throw in the old yell, "Look out below," and seeing how the players react.
Yep. Okay, it's one way.
Yeah. There's a reason why townsmen in CNS characters get a bonus on agility.
I have a medieval townscape behind me, very fake one with a GRC tavern. Mo Khan has a really good one here. How do you evolve your setting from one campaign to the next? And I suppose the unasked question there is, do you evolve your setting from one campaign to the next? Do you tell a continuous story? Does one campaign follow another? Or do you just scotch that world and move on? Steve, I'm going to start with you there, because you have your game world. So how do you evolve it?
Well, I will evolve the campaign. Treason, for example, evolves the campaign from the starting point. Anything that we'll produce for Marrakesh will be at a fixed point in time. Same with Han. But certainly adventures that we bring out will advance that campaign world. Sort of Treason has a plot that could have major implications if the players don't succeed.
And in your own
Oh, in my own game, if I'm running my own game in Marrakesh, that will continue to change. And I will have notes of what I've changed, that if at some point I want to do Marrakesh 20 years on, then I'll have the notes and I will use what players have done to change the campaign world.
Do you go as far as, I'm thinking back of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, Gary Gygax, sort of it's impossible to play a campaign unless an accurate record of time is kept. You know, do we go as far as calendars and how long people are spending traveling from one place to the other, or, you know, little Johnny must be 6 now?
To a certain extent, but not fully accurate. It's if 6 years have passed in the campaign world, 6 years have passed. You don't need all the detail in between.
Guy, do you keep a continuous world? Do you evolve campaigns, or do you
usually jump
throw
around
and start again?
Yeah, I've never been accused of running a small campaign. And by that, I mean, usually my players are world-ending, catastrophic type of stuff. In the one campaign world, which I've been running now, I had players eventually assassinate the gods, and the paladin managed to maneuver himself to becoming the one true deity that ruled over my world. And that was quite a shift. And when they said that campaign then ended, and they said, okay, let's do another one. And I said, all right, well, do you want to be pre the convergence or post convergence? And they all went, if he's a god, I don't want to be in that world. So no, I would rather be pre-convergence. You know, I mean, that's just friendly banter. Having said that, that same campaign, I like the world setting because it's been growing over sort of 10 years or so with players' input creating the space. I wanted to do a sci-fi game. So I took, quite literally, I took the original map, and all of the towns on the maps just became planets. And I've just transposed it into science fiction. And so dwarves, because dwarves in space, I'm not a starfinder. What is it? A starfinder. I'm not a fan of what they did, which was literally just to move it into space. So dwarves are now these strange, hairy aliens known as the dwarvash. So it's close to dwarf, but it's not too close that you think of dwarves. But they're short and they're hairy, and they've got lots of hair everywhere, and they've got a funny sort of accent, and that's what they do, is flying around and picking up scrap and seeing monsters in Nebula. So that, I don't know if that's evolution or just transcription or just really being lazy and not actually having to come up with a new science fiction world. But anyway, it is what it is. So that's what I do.
Kirsten, with a lot of vampire stuff there's an awful lot of politics and wheeler dealing and alliances shift and new things rise. Does all of that reflect on your next campaign, or do you clean sheet?
Usually not, because I play in different cities. But that said, I did play in One World by Night when I was in college, which was all about that, where we had different LARPs all over the world affecting the universe, the world of darkness, right? And it was amazing, and it has forever changed how I see vampire, and I always want these huge games now as a result, because it's so cool when someone's doing stuff in Brazil that affects all the Bruja everywhere, right? And then they, so I love that idea. I haven't had a chance to do it with my campaigns. They tend to be much smaller in scope, but it's really awesome. It's a great idea.
I was just going to click on Yasmin's making NPCs more 3D as answered, and it's not quite, 'cause Guy and I have sort of given our ideas, but Kirsten, how would you do that?
What?
Make NPCs more three-dimensional.
Because I'm writing, I tend to put a lot more work into the NPCs than I would like on the fly at the table. But like when I'm running D&D, for example, usually I just come up with a few, like they have what they want, right? They have what they really don't want. And then I just come up with a few quirks for them, like whether that's an accent, like my Boston, one of my characters had a Boston accent that just made everyone at the table laugh every time she spoke. Or whether it's like, they're always like, I play the guy at the Friendly Fiend in Sigil. He always gives the players a minor magic item every time they come in. He's like, here, have this for your adventure. So they love him, even though he's obviously a fiend. So I try to give every, like, important NPCs like that, something that they do, the players will like, oh, he's gonna, so they can predict. And then they feel really smart. And then the character seems like it has some motivation, even though I doubt Akin is ever going to do anything big in the world, because that's for the players to do. They always feel like he's up to something, and it makes him really 3D as a fiend. So yeah, it's motivation and like negative motivation, like the things that they don't want, and then like quirks or things they do that let the players predict their behavior.
Steve?
Yeah, it's very similar. The one game I'm running on Discord at the moment, the players have encountered a troll who's actually employed by one of the local industries because he's really good at making nails. And he's just rewarded the characters for delivering a ton of nails, which was an interesting task for them, with a cart and 2 oxen. And he's presented them with a collection of nice knives. So they're now thinking, are they enchanted? Is this troll a weapon crafter?
Uh-huh.
Because all I've seen him doing is smashing iron with his fists and making nails.
Fantastic. So give NPCs a quirk.
Yeah.
I think, none of us have time, apart from the chat we were discussing the other day, to work out what every NPC has in their pockets, who their relations are, and what their views of them are. So I think one of mine, aside from where's my motivation, is like remember teachers from school and how they behaved. What their mannerisms were, which may be why player characters keep getting told to concentrate And you know, you could be really good if only you applied yourself. No, sorry, that's me regressing. I try not to do that to players.
Can I ask you all a quick question on this particular subject? I have fallback NPCs, which it's awful, and I wish I didn't. But I in the spur of the moment, it's like, oh God, they're talking to a trader. Okay, well in that case, then he has everything that will not break, and if it breaks, it's meant to do that because that's part of the design. So do you have fallback NPCs, stock standard? If they need a youthful child, it will be this kind of child, or does that crop up in your games?
Kirsten?
Sometimes. I like Vampire is the game I played the longest, so whenever I make NPCs, I have to try really hard to be like, okay, I'm not playing the harpy from that game. I'm playing the harpy from this game, and it's a man, and you know, like, so I get caught up in that. But yeah, I definitely have like stock personalities for certain roles that I have to consciously try to break out of it, especially for like throwaway NPCs like traders and sometimes even quest givers that aren't really super important except that they mention something, or like the guy on the street that players inevitably want to ask about something. You know, so sometimes I find that tables really help me with that. It's a dwarf and it's a man and he's grumpy. That helps me, you know, steer away from my usual whatever it is that I might break out.
Steve?
I tend to draw on the many years from a commercial background. Having worked in the steel and chemical industries, and having worked in wages and been down on the shop floor, there are so many characters you find on factory shop floors that there's so many with quirks that you can just, I'll remember him. And the guy shuffling around the shop floor pushing a broom, and that's his job for 40 hours a week. And you sort of remember those as characters.
Mm-hmm.
That probably wasn't his job 40 hours a week, but what one of the old guys in a warehouse taught me when I was a kid, if you're ever short of anything to do, pick up a broom and push it around and they won't give you another job.
Yeah.
And so exactly what you're saying. I know that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Carry on.
So, yeah. And also with having been a deck collector, when you're speaking to people over the phone, you get mental images of these people, and you can put those into your game as NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
And draw your experience from your jobs.
What I do if I have the time, and I keep sort of little notes of these in. I use Evernote quite a lot because I can access it on my phone, on my desktop, my laptop, wherever I am. I do keep sort of some stock NPCs, but I actually draw them up a little bit. So if I need somebody quickly, I have my own little pool of shorthand notes, because if I don't have that, then every barman speaks like this, and every dwarf sums up Gaul, because my dwarves are Yorkshire, not Scottish. And I'm terrible at accents. If I try and do Liverpool, I sort of segue into Welsh. I can't hold a consistent accent. I did once try to do an American accent, and I have to say this because we've had to go at Americans trying to pronounce British place names.
Or Chestershire.
Yeah, fantastic. But I had a couple of Americans in one game, and it was set in Andoran in Galorian, which is like obviously truth, freedom, and the American way of life. Part of that fantasy world. So I adopted an American accent, which they informed me managed to migrate all the way down the East Coast from Boston to Louisiana. Sometimes in a single sentence.
Yes.
But what I got away from, what I took out from that was, I didn't go Midwest or West Coast.
Don't you know?
We've got one from Adam here, and we did skip over the world building a little bit. Do you prefer the outside in approach of doing the big picture and going into further detail in world building, or the inside out approach of starting with something smaller and specific, building outward. I tend to call those they top down or they bottom up approaches to world building. And my favorite is to meet in the middle, because you've got to do the big picture of how big the world is and what its year is and what its religions
you need a foundation for the detail.
Yeah, Steve. Foundation. Okay, Kirsten.
For the way I do things, I tend to do inside out. So the players have to start somewhere, and I have to get that part ready. And then I can sort of layer on. Also, I mean, just in terms of like even using a published setting, you don't, like, especially like when I run Planescape, you cannot dump all of that information on the players. You can't, even if you have it all. And I assume it's the same, when you write your own, you just have to sort of organically let it expand to, like I use the can't and everything in my game, but you can't just like throw it all on them all at once. So I find, when I do things, it tends to be like inside out, in that it starts in a small place. And then I slowly expand. Like I don't start out with the rules for all the planes and how it affects magic. I maybe pick, they go to hell and this thing happens whenever you cast fire spells. So they're like, ooh, where we are matters. And then you slowly build all the rules out from there on something like that. And that's not even something I created. But that's how I do it anyway.
Guy.
Yeah, I do a big world map, and then I will ask my players, what type of campaign do you want, what sort of setting, etc., etc. And then I will just choose a particular piece of coastline that's rather difficult to escape from. And then if I do a map of that area, it's usually within 3 days of riding or transportation access. So it's a 3-day circle around that. I'll just draw out stuff, but I don't have a plan. If it's a blank piece of paper, it's like, well, there's a plane there and there's maybe a dungeon underneath the plane that was in a temple that was built 20,000 years ago. Don't care who built it. Don't care what's in there, but it's a location on the map. So if they want to go off of that map, that's fine. And I'll ad lib as I can until I then need to draw the next sort of journeyable distance, basically. That's how I work. And then minutia gets filled in as we go.
And the last question from Faraz, we did touch on this a little bit earlier, but how do you go about building a culture? Steve, you were saying that you draw a mishmash of cultures from earthly cultures, and I think this is going on the theory that stealing from one person is plagiarism, or in this case, cultural appropriation, but stealing from many is research.
Yes.
Kirsten, I mean, you're creating a culture of vampires.
Well, yeah, and it just depends on the game and the players that I have. Like, I like to really incorporate, like Guy was saying, like incorporate what my players said. Oh, your sire's from here, and your venture line does this. Okay, well, that's now part of my world, and there's a line of entry that do this, and everybody knows about it. So you have infamous or famous or whatever, So, like, I really tailor my games to my players when I do that. And I'm always doing that. Like, players are like, I had a player, like, this is the 80s, so ShrekNet for the vampires doesn't, for the Nosferatu doesn't exist yet because computers are still, So I'm like, all right, you guys want to create ShrekNet in Texas? Let's do it. You're creating ShrekNet now with your, so kind of letting players really influence like what the culture of the city is like. My game is a Gangrel game, so it's very different than if you played like Paris or something. And that's down to how the players sort of what they do. I let them, oh, it's okay to wander around in Elysium in your shorts and tank top. It's a Gangrel game, I guess so.
Guy, I'm guessing that you're going to tell me that you do. Well, you've already mentioned in this that you do quite a bit of farming out to the players. If they want to come from a culture, it's their job. How do you do it yourself?
Generally, it's a really tricky one, and the long and short of it is, I will transpose. I'll take an existing culture and then just drag it across into my world, and then ask the question. All right, so classic example, the Dark Elves. How, if I want them to be Roman and I want them to behave like Romans from the Roman Republic era, before the emperors were around, what would be differentiators? What difference is a dark elf living underground going to have, as opposed to a Roman living in the Roman period during the Republic? And to then say, okay, well, the agriculture is different. So I haven't studied Roman agriculture, but I'm fairly certain they didn't have giant mushroom farms tended by giant spiders.
You're on fairly safe ground.
Yeah, I think so. I don't remember friends, Romans, countrymen, giant spider riders being part of that speech. So, but yes, so that's what I then do. And what I find is by choosing a culture and then adapting according to that, it does make it obviously it makes it feel as if it's part of that space. It makes it work a little bit better. But magic always screws things up. And I haven't yet found a fantasy world, and I haven't been brave enough yet to try and create a fantasy world where magic is actually incorporated on a truthful level. Because if it really did exist, how would that impact the world? And you go, well, oh, you could do this thought experiment. No, but go even further back. If you look at how cultures evolve, fire was hugely influential for us as a species. Well, imagine if we could just make fire by clicking our fingers together. The first magician would have been super powerful, and how would that have then evolved and changed? Anyway, so those are the big questions, and I don't answer those. I go with the modern day. Yeah, magic happens, but it's only a select few, and it's in the background, and it's for some unknown reason didn't claim power, etc., etc.
That sort of the first magician becomes a hero segues onto a very, very late question, which are we going to answer one more? Because I like this one. How do you deal with players getting famous or becoming a person of high importance? Steve, I'm going to start with you on that, because Chivalry and Sorcery has its social status system and its fiefs and its reputations and its honor. So lead us off on that. This is the mechanical approach.
Okay, if further up the tree a player gets, there's always somebody below them who wants that position. And there's always somebody above them who feels threatened. So they're going to get squeezed from both ways, both from below and above. And in a medieval setting, it's so easy for a king to call somebody a traitor, and with the consequences that follow on.
So you don't necessarily let them enjoy the fruits of their success there.
Oh,
there's more challenges.
Yeah, you let them enjoy it for a small period, and then you start putting all the obstacles in the way. Like, the king wants you to go to this country on your own as a delegate.
For no particular reason other than that you have to be on your own and travel on this particular stretch of road.
Yes. And just don't go into the New Forest where there are archers about.
So for those that don't know, that's how a King of England was assassinated. Or was it an accident? The debate's still going on.
Just rumoured. Conspiracy.
Guy, what do you do with fame and fortune and status if players earn it?
The most important thing that I do is I make sure that it doesn't bog the game down. So it's great to have them get a piece of land, and I think it's amazing role-playing opportunity if they are knighted or if they're turned into a noble and they're given a castle that they now have to look after. But the minutiae of managing all of that, I sweep under the carpet. I don't do the mechanic. Oh, well, now your castle's got to raise 23 gold each month, and because that's not the type of game that they wanted to start playing. But yes, once they have all the power, then absolutely, exactly as Stephen says, there are people out there against them. There are people that are for them. I think that's also important, is to balance it and make sure that it's not everyone who's trying to betray them. But they also have to have a castle steward or an advisor or somebody who's going to running the estate on their behalf whilst they're away, and possibly also making sure that there are certain changes that are affected so that when they return, they don't necessarily own the castle anymore, but that was a small technicality. All those kinds of wonderful things.
Yeah, I think it depends also on your group of players.
Yes.
I ran a campaign in AD&D 2nd edition, and I got a group of experienced players. And what they used to do, every time they were returning back to the town or the city, they would wait and they go in, creep in at night. They give lots of money to all the beggars on the streets with little flags. And come the morning, as I entered the town, all the beggars would be lying in the streets waving these little flags. He went on that to make the most of their fame, they built themselves a museum of all their greatest exploits. And one of their hirelings, a halfling thief, on one expedition had been decapitated. So they embalmed his body, brought it back to the museum, and recreated this scene in clockwork. So as people went round the museum, they came round, and the halfling's head would sort of come off using clockwork mechanisms.
Oh my word!
I
thought until you came up with that last sentence, I thought I can top this, but I can't top that.
Yeah,
Kirsten.
What Stephen was saying is exactly how I run Vampire. There's always a smaller fish. There's always a bigger fish. Because it's all about politics. But I also play neonate games, which the express purpose is you are never going to be awesome because you're a neonate in the time frame of this game. You're never going to be an elder. So the whole point is like they're the little fish, right? So that's how I tend to handle that aspect of Vampire. But for D&D, like in Planescape, same thing. Because of the nature of the planes, there's always a more powerful entity than the players. And so the way I run it is I usually give them a base and sigil, so they have whatever property and sigil, and they can build out from there. They did a similar thing to your players, Stephen. They had a museum of all of the things they killed in their house, including a modron that was strung up. I'm like, you guys, you know that these are sentient creatures that you're making mannequins out of sentient creatures, right? And they're like, oh yeah. And they got their property seized for doing this.
Thank heavens I have a paladin in my second edition game.
My group actually did go a little bit further. That I was throwing Spelljammer in and all sorts, and I gave them a giant space hamster.
Oh, fantastic!
They killed it, but they killed it so carefully. They skinned it, and they inflated the skin of this giant space hamster and had it hovering over the museum with the advertising banner on it.
Oh!
So my one for fame and fortune was, well, fame, really, because they didn't win much fortune out of it. I did have the local town. It was a Rise of the Rune Lords game, so Sandpoint was so grateful to them for being the heroes of Sandpoint that they commissioned a statue of the party in heroic poses and put it in a location that I later knew would be semi-destroyed, so they would come across statues of themselves after the ground has sunk. But the party bard just went one better. He created Heroes of Sandpoint the musical, because Sandpoint has a theatre. So he wrote and staged a musical, and he insisted that he take the lead role. And so we rolled his performance check, and it was an absolute sellout. It was one of the best shows that Sandpoint had ever seen. And so every time they were back in Sandpoint, made an agreement with the theatre that it would continue running. And eventually it was successful enough that the theatre asked, could they take it on tour? And yes, but he has to audition the stand-ins, the people who are going to play him. Doesn't care about who plays anybody else, just who plays him. And so he allowed a touring production on there. So that gave him a little bit of income, and it spread their fame far and wide, which was great because I knew they were leaving that area soon. And wherever else they go, they go to the Dwarven Kingdom, half a continent away. I hear there's this new production out in Syria. You're from that? Did you catch it? Is it any good? If they start touring here, should we book tickets? So yeah, Heroes of Sandpoint the musical was a real high point in a campaign, because in a grim dark campaign, you need sometimes that lift, and you need to give players their head. Coming up with a musical about their exploits is a new one on me, and I loved it. On that note, we have no more open questions. We're 18 minutes out of time. We've just got NASA popping in with, does there come a time when the world has to end? No, but there comes a time when a panel discussion has to.
Sneaky. I like
Yeah,
that.
I'm proud of myself for that one. So I would really like to thank our panelists, Kirsten Hofstad, Stephen Turner, Guy Sclanders. It's been an absolute pleasure. I haven't made notes on this, but I'm going to go back and re-listen to steal the bestest ideas, because this is the only way you improve as a games master, is by stealing other people's ideas, seeing what works for you, modifying them to fit your style. And somebody anonymous up there is saying, DMs are sociopaths with power, only because you let them. we have no real power or authority. We just find some on the floor, we pick it up, and we beat your heads with it. We have our last panel session tonight is on old school gaming. That will be at 9 o'clock UAE time. We have some games running. Steve, I think you mentioned just before this panel started that you have a couple of spaces in your Chivalry and Sorcery game on Hangouts.
Yeah. I've actually. It will now be on Zoom.
Oh, it's going to be on Zoom now. Fantastic. Yeah. We have several other games running this afternoon. There is a full agenda on the Warhorn page, which you can find through the GRC website or Facebook page. You can follow Guy on YouTube. He has a extensive series of, I think you mentioned yesterday, something like more than 8,000 minutes of GMing advice.
About 400 videos or so, yeah.
Yeah. And I do highly recommend them. You can follow Steve Turner on Patreon if you is it under Britannia Game Designs or your own?
Yes.
Under Britannia Game Designs with 2 T's for trademark purposes. Steve does know how to spell Britannia, but there was another group using that, and he refused to change the name. Because once you're taking a party down a path, keep them on that path. Yeah. So, Kirsten, do you have anything online for players to follow, or is it all sort of you're keeping it on your text chat?
No, I just kind of run for my friends and stuff. My vampire game is online, and it's so. If you want to play vampire in Texas, go line dancing. Message me. But other than that,
have you ever seen Near Dark?
No,
hillbilly vampire.
Yeah.
Movie. I love that. So it's the kind of vampires who would line dance. Thank you very much. Thank you to our admin and our assistant on there with tech support. Thank you very much to the attendees. There have been some fantastic questions on there. And if you're watching on Facebook, I hope you enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you all.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.